As I told you before, Revelation 14 and 15. We're going to have our second reference to the 144,000 in the book of Revelation. And this might be also what some would classify as another parenthetical example. In other words, where they're telling a story and then they stop and then describe a scene in heaven. Okay. Read the first 5 verses of Revelation 14. Then I looked, and behold, the Lamb was standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his name and the name of his Father written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the sound of many waters, and like the sound of loud thunder. And the voice which I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps. And they sang a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn the song except the 144,000 who have been purchased from the earth. These are the ones who have not been defiled with women, for they have kept themselves chaste. They are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been purchased from among men as first fruits to God and to the Lamb, and no lie was found in their mouth. They are blameless. So, second reference to the 144,000. Let me read Revelation 7 and 4 again from a few weeks back. And I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000, sealed from every tribe of the sons of Israel. And we went over that. We listed the tribe numbers and 12,000 from each one. This seems to be a little different this time. And I always look through 2 or 3, 4 or 5, sometimes different commentaries. And what the consensus seems to be here is what most people think, anyway, those who are interpreting Revelation like we are, is that the 144,000 in chapter 7 are literally 144,000 people, children of Israel. And the 144,000 in this chapter 14 is more of a symbolic reference for the redeemed. Now, there's somewhat different interpretations of that. I don't know if I hold to that. I kind of hold it. They're both symbolic. Time will tell. But one thing that separates the two from 7 and 14 in Revelation 7, would seem to describe activity on earth, and these people are on earth. And whereas chapter 14, there's another scene in heaven. My view is probably they're both symbolic, but that's just my opinion, and that's against the majority of those who I read. Once again, this is another interlude, and this might be the last interlude of all the books. I was just going to summarize some of them. We'll go over again. Seems like we'll talk about the events on earth, and then there'll be a scene in heaven again in the throne room. So chapter 4, we had the scene in heaven in the throne room. Remember we talked about the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures. These characters are also mentioned in the next chapter 5. Again in chapter 7, the term that was used, a multitude around the throne. Again in Revelation 11, when the 7th trumpet is released. Finally again here in chapter 14. So that's 4 to 5 different references to the throne room in heaven. So I wanted to stress my point again that all the book in some ways is chronological. In another sense, it's not. It's kind of like it's telling a continuous story, but sometimes it'll go back, sometimes it'll pause and go to heaven with a scene in there, which is kind of like the Old Testament. In my daily reading, I finish up the Old Testament this week, Malachi. Genesis chronologically is the first book, and Malachi the last. But there's, if you read through the Old Testament, it's not a straight chronological work. It'll kind of at the beginning goes to the law and the judges, and then by the time you get to the Ezra and Nehemiah, it takes you to the captivity. Then it goes back Psalms. Then it goes to the prophets. And even the major and minor prophets are not in order. Some come later who lived before the ones like for example, Isaiah, we written in Jeremiah was 100 years later. But it's not a straight work, in other words. But it does finish chronologically. Same as Revelation I don't view it as straight chronological, but at the beginning of the book, it tells what's about to unfold, and by the end, of course, it is the end of all things, or everything. God's final plan comes to consummation. So, and reason I brought that up, because this is really the last time where we're going to have this interlude that is seen in heaven. Basically, from this point on forward, it's just going to be describing the last events that are happening on earth before Jesus returns. And as we close the lesson today, we'll see chapter 15, or the end of chapter 15 will set the stage for that. So these are the 144,000 interpreted by, like I said, by the majority of people who take this perspective as literal in 7, figurative in 14, and the terms are used as basically in this chapter kind of like a spiritual term for people who haven't or who are fully devoted to God and are serving Him. So we move on to verse 6. And I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, having an eternal gospel to preach to those who live on earth, and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people. And he said with a loud voice, Fear God, give Him glory, because the hour of His judgment has come. Worship Him who made the heaven and the earth and sea and springs of waters. Then another angel, this is a second one, number 2, followed, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality. And we're going to get into the fall of Babylon in a couple chapters and a couple weeks away. But I want to bring up this angel. Last week, we talked about the mark of the beast. One of the questions raised was, could it be taken by mistake? We know that if you're pre-trib, that won't be if it's a pre-tribulation rapture, that won't be an issue, or maybe even mid-trib. But if the church is here, or even if not, those who become believers after the tribulation has started, this seems one verse to indicate, there will be signs not to do this. And also, as we're coming towards the end, see, it's desperate times, and the Lord is going to desperate measures, actually sending out an angel to proclaim the gospel. This is a message that will be hard to reject, for the lost world around those who still haven't given their heart to the Lord. How will this be accomplished? Will He literally appear before groups of people all over the world? For years, I support the Jesus film. They go over all the world, show the Jesus film to lost groups. And just so many times, Muslim people will come up to him and they'll watch the film and say, that's the man who appeared into my dream and said, follow me. And it just seems like it's happened all over the Middle East. And will the Lord do this? Will this angel appear to just simultaneously to groups all over the world and say, you need to worship the Lord, the days are about to come to an end? Or maybe saying this false leader is a false prophet and you need to follow the Lord. Whatever the case, somehow the Lord is really going to, give humanity one last chance, because it's about over. And another point I wanted to raise here, from the beginning, we've interpreted Revelation of things that haven't occurred yet. And as we're reading these things here, when has anything like this ever happened in the past? No one can say this has ever happened before. We're describing things that are unique and things that are yet to come, because I can't think of anything where you compare that will describe these things that are being written here in these upcoming chapters, unless you take everything in the book symbolically. And when you do that, you can basically be your own interpreter and make them say what they want to. So I have to hold to the literal position that these things are still yet to come, and that the Lord will send angels to the earth to proclaim the gospel, giving man one last chance to turn to Him before they're doomed. And if they do not, we're going to see what happens. Chapter 14, verses 9 through 13. Then another angel, a third one, right? This is the third one now, beginning with these warnings. Followed them, saying with a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast and his image, and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, He also will drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is mixed in full strength in the cup of his anger. And listen to this warning. And he will be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest day and night, those who worship the beast in his image, and whoever receives a mark of his name. Here is the preservation of the saints who keeps the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. So again, we talked about, could it be possible that a believer could take the mark by mistake? And this seems to say that there will be ample warning that if we are here, or if future believers are here, when the mark of the beast is instituted, we have warnings from angels: do not take this, or you'll be doomed. If some would say, well, if they're going to tell that, who on earth would take the mark of the beast? Well, it seems like the wicked get hard-hearted and more hard-hearted, and they'll, I can see them actually rejecting even angelic messages and saying, who are you to tell us what to do? We're following this man who's leading us into a new, speaking of the Antichrist, a new hope, a new world. They'll ignore it. They'll take the mark. And the Bible clearly states anyone who takes this is doomed for eternity. You'll be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Now, unlike this class, not everyone takes this book literally. I guess symbolically, maybe they could say this refers to if you make a decision to not follow the Lord, to follow the devil. In that sense, you'll be with him for all eternity. That's true, but other than that, this really seems to be describing something, event that will actually come to this earth instead of something that has already happened. And thus I have to draw that conclusion. This is describing the mark of the beast. It parallels, the last week we talked about the implementation of the mark. This week we talk about what happens if you take the mark. As we read about the perseverance of the saints on earth, at the start of the book we had a scene in heaven. So the scene seems to shift from heaven to earth, from the end of tribulation back to we're back in the tribulation. I'll make one more point on this final verse, verse 13. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, right, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds will follow them. And I really didn't know what that verse meant. And I started to look in a couple of commentaries to see what that could mean. And one of the commentaries I came across that seemed to describe it the best was, this may refer to the fulfillment of the Beatitudes. When Jesus stands on the mountain and says, blessed are they, blessed are those who mourn, they should be comforted. This might just be a statement that's saying all the hurt, all the labor, all the sacrifice that the followers of Christ have made over the centuries are about to be fulfilled. Blessed are the dead, those who have died in the Lord. They may rest from their labors, for their deeds will follow them. And it might also be saying, his plan is about to be fulfilled. The end is about to come, and so follow him as time is almost over. From that sense. As we go to the next portion of the verse, we're going to have symbolic language describing how the Lord defines the last days. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap is come, because the harvest of the earth is ripe. Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Always throughout the church age, it seems to be the symbol used for the lost was the harvest. I remember Jesus' words were, the harvest is plentiful, the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he'll send forth laborers into the harvest. It always seems to be the sign. One of the many end time movies I watched, one is called End of the Harvest. And it wasn't really about like the tribulation or anything. It was about a debate club in college where a Christian guy would present his view of the end of the world. And one of the main stars of the movie kept having a recurring dream. And it was this old farmer in a field. He was taking one of those old-fashioned sickles and he was cutting wheat. In other words, kind of a symbol like what the Lord will do at the end of the harvest. So this is really his last gathering. So we have reference to the harvest, but we also have references, in a negative sense too. Verse 17, another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Then an under angel, the one who has power over fire, came out from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, put in your sharp sickle, and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe. So we ever heard terms like grapes of wrath and the harvest. So apparently in the old days when they make wine, they put all the grapes, to a thing, and they would mash them and mash them and mash them, and then the juice would come out and make the wine. So this is like the final harvest has come. The Lord has presented the gospel here. Those who have rejected it will then begin to start facing the wrath of the Lord. And this sickle that we talked about, he's swinging, verse 19, so the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. So this isn't talking to them. And the harvest earlier, we talked about the loss. This group that he is gathering here are those instead who have rejected the Lord and here being thrown into the wrath of God. So it does specifically say here that those who are rejecting the gospel will face the wrath of God. This isn't the devil persecuting them. This is the Lord himself who will punish them.
Revelation 14:20. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horse's bridle for a distance of, it says in my version here, 200 miles. And it also is known to say, bear with me one second here, 1,600 stadia in other interpretations. Whatever the case, probably symbolic reference of blood this deep. I guess it would be in the valley of Armageddon or Megiddo, because of all the carnage that is about to occur. So we can see this fifth angel has pronounced this, proclaims God's wrath is about to be completed. Now, my view again here, this blood up to the horse's bridle, which is kind of a famous saying over the years, excuse me, might be a symbolic as far as the measurement, but what it's portraying is the message that, death and destruction will be everywhere as a result of this. And that's how we close out chapter 14 and move into chapter 15. We'll begin with the first 4 verses of the 15th chapter, and then we'll summarize these again. Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels who had 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. And I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who had been victorious over the beast and his image and the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, holding harps of God. And they sang the song of Moses, the bondservant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are your works, O Lord God the Almighty. Righteous and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy. For all the nations will come and worship before you, for your righteousness acts have been revealed. All throughout these lessons, whenever we read a passage of Scripture that kind of is a callback to earlier portions of the book, I like to go over them and review them again. And what's recorded here in these first 2 verses is very similar to what happens back in Revelation 6, 9 through 11. So I'm going to read those two back to back again and see if you see there's a slight difference here. Well, maybe we'll discuss that briefly. All right, back to Revelation 6, the seals were being opened. The first seal was the Antichrist, second war, third famine, fourth was death, and fifth was the martyrs. So Revelation 6, 9 through 11. When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? One more verse. And there was given to each of them a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as if they had been, would be completed also. So when that verse is delivered in the fifth seal in chapter 6, it makes it sound like the resurrection has not occurred. It really looks like the saints are in heaven, still in their spirit bodies, awaiting the resurrection, awaiting for the vengeance of the Lord to occur. And it sounds like that the Lord has given them a message, hold on a little bit longer, it's not quite time yet. In contrast, the verses that we read just here, it seems to imply that it has been completed. Verse 2, for back to chapter 15. And I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who had been victorious over the beast and his image, and the number of his name, standing on the sea of glass, holding harps of God. So what this implies to me here, this has occurred, the resurrection has occurred, the persecution has ended, and God's wrath has been poured out on the enemies of his people all throughout the centuries. So back in Revelation 6, not quite time yet. Back in Revelation 15, it is complete. Although, as we know, there's still a little bit more in the book to read. But as it does several times in Revelation, it does seem to forward to the end of the tribulation period, and then goes back again to describe events that will occur. One thing I noted down here, sometimes a book of Revelation is mistakenly called Revelations, but in a sense it is, because it's one story after another referring to the scene in heaven and then back down to earth. And as we again focus, the shift on earth is about to get really bad again, so it just seems to be one collection of stories after the other, all coming towards an end goal of the consummation and the kingdom coming into earth. So although the events don't happen exactly one after the other, and they take a break on occasion, they all seem to be going towards that trend that's taking us to the finish of the book. All right, we conclude the 15th chapter, verses 5 through 8. After these things I looked, and the temple of the tabernacle of testimony of heaven was open. And the seven angels who had the seven plagues came out of the temple, clothed in linen, clean and bright, and girded around their chests with golden sashes. Then one of the four living creatures gave to the seven angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with the smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no one was able to enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. Okay? A couple of other, once again, references back to Revelation. It talks about a temple in heaven. If you'll remember a few chapters back, Revelation 11, the chapter involving the 2 witnesses, it said in verse 19, and the temple of God which is in heaven was open, and the ark of his covenant appeared in his temple, and there were flashes of lightnings and sounds of peals of thunder, and an earthquake and a great hailstorm. Is there a literal temple in heaven? This seems to imply it, or at least for now. We'll read in later chapters that the temple is no longer needed when everything has been wrapped up. But for the time being, and even at this moment, there may be one in heaven with an actual Ark of the Covenant there. Also makes reference to that in the book of Hebrews. Whether or not that's symbolic, no one can know for sure. There is a verse toward the end of, like I said, at the end of Revelation, that will show that in one day there will not be a temple in that city, for the Lord will be there himself. But for the time being, maybe there is one down there. Now here's another reference also to the four creatures. All throughout the book, it seems to reference those. Remember them all the way back in the beginning. One looked like a man, one looked like a lion, one looked like an ox, and one looked like an eagle. And finally, this last verse here. But before I wanted to do that, this kind of reminded me of a passage back in the Old Testament, back in the book of 2 Chronicles. Now, as we read here, smoke is coming in the temple. The seven angels are coming with the last instruments of God's wrath. We had the seven seals, we had the seven trumpets, and now he's about to come with the seven vials. Basically, this is what wraps up the tribulation period and brings in the kingdom. And perhaps Israel now will reach the state that it never really had, but the closest it ever came to this, it was a similar situation to this here. I'm going to go back in your Old Testament to 2 Chronicles chapter 7, and I was going to read just the first 3 verses. After 400 years in bondage, over 400 years as slaves, 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and then a time period of judges where the children of Israel were inconsistent. Under King David, they finally really reached what the Lord had planned for them, and through his son, it began to even expand it further. He completed the magnificent temple, and the day it was dedicated, chapter 7 describes it. Now when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. The priests could not enter into the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. All the sons of Israel, seeing the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshiped and gave praise to the Lord, saying, Truly he is good, truly his loving kindness is everlasting. After that point, Israel never reached a peak so high again. They continued a few decades later. They were split into kingdoms. The northern kingdom never came back. They were into exile to Babylon and came back in the 4th and 5th century BC. They were under Greek control and then Roman control during the time of the Lord. And then Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. But then in 1948, miraculously, Israel became a nation again. And although God's method of communicating with his people now is the church, he still has a place for Israel. And as during this tribulation, at long last, they'll realize, who they'll finally accept Jesus, who he truly is as the Savior, the Messiah, the Son of God. And the scene that occurs here that I just described with the smoke of the temple is kind of a throwback. So almost 3,000 years ago, when they reached their peak, they've never reached it again. And then once again, when the kingdom is about to come on earth and establish 1,000 years of peace. But before then, there still is some wrath. Closing out this temple again, the temple was filled with the smoke from the glory of God, from his power, and no one was able to enter the temple. What does this last verse mean? First of all, it brings back many of our, besides the Old Testament memories, which I already talked about, we've talked about they also suggest that the final judgment is complete now. This is what this smoke is representing. And as the judgment is being complete, he sends out these last 7 angels. Now, we've talked about the 3 traditional views of the rapture of the church. There's the pre-tribulation rapture, teaches the church will be raptured before the 7-year tribulation. Mid-tribulation, they'll be raptured halfway through it, the 3.5-year point. And finally, the post-trib teaches that the rapture and the second coming occur at the same time. But there is a 4th position, a fairly new one, that's only been taught in recent years, and it's called the Pre-Wrath Rapture. And what that teaches is that the majority of the church goes through a majority of the 7-year tribulation, and right before God's final wrath is poured out here, that is when the rapture occurs. This would happen, I'd say, at least 3/4 of the way through, so probably at the 5 or 6 year point, the Lord would rapture his church out just before his final wrath is poured out in the Battle of Armageddon and so forth. So there's your 4 rapture time views. Always had the pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, and the pre-wrath is occurring at this time just before the bowls of wrath are about to be poured out, which are the most severe of all the plagues on the earth, but they seem to last not as long as previous ones. So as we close out this chapter, and we're coming up into the bowls of wrath in the next couple of chapters, 16, 17, and 18, the destruction of Mystery Babylon. We have good news and bad news. The good news is it's almost over. After centuries of waiting for the Lord's return in peace on earth, it's about to here. But the bad news is just before he does return, it's going to get worse than ever, even worse. We described some horrible things. They're even going to top that, and it'll fulfill the words of the Lord. Matthew 24, let me go back here. When he describes his tribulation, when he warns his people about what's coming to the earth, that is the sound of the trumpet. That's my phone. So we'll just close with that, with this verse. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of time, the world, until now, nor will ever be. And as this phone sounds, we don't know what time the trumpet will sound.